Okay, we're going to look at Curley's wife today. She's a fascinating character within the novel because Steinbeck really makes you shift in terms of the way that you respond to her during the course of the novel. One minute you feel a huge amount of sympathy for her, and the next minute you're condemning her as a racist pig. Okay, the first description of her then. Steinbeck, with lots of the characters in the novel, has a paragraph or so where he initially describes their physical appearance when you first encounter them. Um, what's interesting, particularly with Curley's wife, I think, is that that's certainly not the initial description of her, because our first impression of Curley's wife as readers is moulded by Candy. One of the first things he says about her is he says he's talking to George and Lenny about Curley's wife, having spoken about Curley as well, and he says she got the eye, meaning she's looking at the other men in a way to try and seduce them, and he calls her a tart. And this misogynistic representation of her, his decision to label her in this very derogatory way as sexually promiscuous, it really has an impact on the way that we see her, and of course the way that George sees her when he first meets her. So when we first meet her, our impression of her has already been shaped by Candy. And so perhaps we interpret her makeup, all the red fingernails and the red just about everything, and the way she's standing even in the doorway and sort of flinging her body forward, we interpret it as flirtatious flamboyance. And as soon as she leaves, in fact, George calls her a tramp and jailbait, implying that she is dangerous and potentially destructive, a possible cause of conflict that could have a really negative impact on his life and on his and Lenny's dream to get some land. If we look at Candy's final words to her in section 5, you can see these misogynistic attitudes, these very sexist, very negative attitudes towards her as a woman coming through again. He's, of course, very distressed at this point because he realizes that because she's lying there dead, Lenny having killed her, that this means the death of the dream. It means that his hopes have been dashed. He's not going to be able to join in with George and Lenny and get the farm at all. But he says this, so he's standing over her dead body and he says, "You goddamn tramp, you done it, didn't you? I suppose you're glad. Everybody knowed you'd messed things up. You wasn't no good, you ain't no good now, you lousy tart." And the way that he's talking about her, again, there, it's, very misogynistic in terms of the language he's using. Notice he calls her a tramp and a tart. He's labeling her in these very derogatory ways. And I think that it skews the way that we see her in the novel, or it can do anyway. Ultimately, of course, she's lying there in section 5. She's lying there dead, and she's the victim of male violence. Now, I know you could argue that, Lenny doesn't do it out of malice, but nevertheless, it's a man who has murdered her, and there she is. We can see her dead body. What does Candy do? He blames her for her own murder. He blames her for the death of the dream. In fact, when he says earlier on in the novel, when he says she got the eye, is he blaming her for even daring to look at men? Candy just seems to spend the whole novel blaming Curley's wife for just about everything, and yet at the end, she's dead. And you can't get away from the fact that she's a victim. She's a victim of male violence, and yet she's being blamed for that. Okay, let's look a bit more at the initial description of her then. The first two words that are used to describe her in the novel are a girl. And so regardless of the way that Candy might describe her, I think that Steinbeck is really trying to emphasize her youth here. The idea of her being this young girl that's isolated, maybe desperately trying to fit in and gain attention of some sort in the harsh, masculine world of the ranch. Look at the fact that she's described as heavily made up. I kind of get the impression that she's a young girl. We don't know exactly how old she is, but she's just trying to get attention, and she realizes that in the world of the ranch, where it doesn't mention any other women on the ranch, so maybe she's the only woman there. How's she going to get attention? She's going to have to use her sexuality in order to get it. It's the makeup that's going to maybe get that attention in some way. Section 5 also represents, talks about her conflict with her mother quite a lot. It says that when she was 15, we don't know exactly how old she is now, but when she was 15, she wanted to leave home, and she accuses her mother of stealing her letters. And her marriage to Curley seems reasonably rushed, I think. She talks about these men that she meets that promise her a role in the movies and so on, but she seems to crave attention and move from one man to another at the dance hall, believing their promises that they could make her famous, and eventually landing on Curley and then getting married to him. She seems to me in that sense quite vulnerable. She doesn't seem happy at home. She seems very disillusioned. She wants to leave home. But in doing so, she finds herself in a vulnerable position where she's at the mercy of men who are potentially going to lie to her, potentially going to abuse her. With Curley, she's very much trapped in a dysfunctional marriage, having been married for a very short period of time. Let's go back to that initial description then. The colour red is unbelievably emphasised, isn't it? It talks about her rouged lips, her fingernails were red, the red mules, red ostrich feathers. In terms of what the connotations of that could be, well, clearly danger is one. She's like going back to what we were saying before, she's described as jailbait, isn't she? Is there the sense of danger in terms of what this could mean for George and Lenny? And the way in which the other men perceive her. They think that any conversation with her, any interaction with her, could be dangerous in terms of what they could get sucked into and the consequences for them in terms of maybe losing their job on the ranch if Curley finds them and decides to have a word with his dad to get them the sack. Maybe it could emphasize red is a sexual color, really. So does it emphasize the idea that that's what she's doing? She's exploiting her sexuality to gain attention. The description of her as well, with the fingernails and the ostrich feathers, a lot of it's very it's for show, isn't it? Perhaps it would be one way of looking at it. Is one of the things that she's doing, in a very sort of brutal, harsh, masculine world where people are wearing denim and they're working in the fields. These are agricultural workers, aren't they? The idea of her wearing such elaborate clothing and putting on her makeup and so on, does it demonstrate her wealth? Is she, perhaps, setting herself apart as someone who's distinct from the men? Is it a means by which she's demonstrating her status? If you think about it, some of the other characters do that, don't they? If you look at the boss, he wears spurs on his boots to prove that he's not a labouring man, doesn't he? If you look at Curley, he has this glove full of Vaseline, doesn't he, to almost show off the fact that he's got a wife. And so, characters seem to try to find ways of demonstrating their superiority, the idea of them being higher in terms of status within the ranch hierarchy. And I just wonder whether the care that she puts into her appearance as an attempt to show off her wealth and her position in that sense. It could be. Her voice, I think, is interesting in the initial description. It's described as brittle, has a nasal quality, but it's also described as brittle. Think about that word. It means something that's easily broken. It could easily be snapped, quite fragile. And does that maybe emphasize her vulnerability? Chapter 4 is really interesting in terms of how she's presented. If it wasn't for chapter 4, I think certainly I would have a lot more sympathy for her. I find it difficult in chapter 4 at times, obviously because of the way that she treats crooks, which we'll get onto a bit later. Initially, though, perhaps Steinbeck is intent on demonstrating that she's worthy of our sympathy. So when she first arrives in Crooks's room, she says, "Think I don't know where they all went, even Curly. I know where they all went." She's aware, it's easy to miss this, but she's aware that her husband has gone into Soledad to go to a brothel for the evening. How humiliating this must be for her. So it's just worth taking that context into account when you look at her interaction with the other characters, with Crooks and Candy and Lenny at that moment. She's coming from a point of complete humiliation because she knows, and she knows everyone else knows, where her husband is that evening. She then, when she recognises that she's one of the 4 weakest characters who've been left there and haven't gone into Soledad for the evening, she uses very derogatory language to establish herself as higher in that ranch hierarchy than Candy and Lenny and Crooks. And she deliberately belittles them by referring to their status as homeless migrant workers. She calls them a bunch of bindle stiffs. She also refers to Candy's age and to Lenny's learning disabilities and to Crooks's race as a means of kind of squashing them down. She's then belittled by Candy. So he talks about her floozy ideas and tells her to, he says, maybe you better go along and roll your hoop, he says. And then introduces the threat of Curley. He says, maybe Curley ain't going to like his wife out in the barn with us bindle stiffs. And in that respect, he's presenting her as sexually promiscuous. The word floozy could have those connotations. Trivial, there's floozy ideas, stupid little silly ideas because you're just a woman is the implication. Insignificant, you're not to be taken seriously. Childish, go along and roll your hoop like a little girl, play with your toys, leave us men to have serious conversations. And also controlled by her husband. It's the threat of Curley that maybe ultimately kind of makes her think, okay, I'll sort of tone down a little bit here. But look at how Candy is using her status as a woman as a weapon against her again at that point. So it's very easy to look at Candy, isn't it, and feel a lot of sympathy for him as a character, and yet the way that he treats Curly's wife maybe makes you look at him in a different light, doesn't it? When Crooks tries to do the same, though, when Crooks tries to stand up to Curly's wife in the way that Candy has, then she asserts herself, and she does so by issuing threats as a white woman, doesn't she? She says, I could get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny. And Crooks says about that later in the chapter. He says, what she says is true. And he recognizes this is absolutely true. All she has to do as a white woman against me as a black man, all she has to do is say, make some accusation, and that's it. Yep, she could get me hung up on a tree. She could get me lynched. It's really difficult to know how to respond to Curly's wife, isn't it? At this moment, though, it's very difficult to forgive her attitude towards Crooks, isn't it? And to me, that has an impact on my overall response to her as a character. And I find it difficult for any sympathy I have for her in other respects to outweigh the way in which she treats Crooks at this moment. But maybe that's me as a man, not having a kind of like an empathy and a sympathy for her as a woman. Maybe I'm not adding and putting enough weight on how I should be responding to her because of her vulnerability within the context of the way that women were treated in 1930s America. Maybe as a man, I'm guilty of not connecting with that enough. I don't know. Okay, chapter 5 then is her chapter, really, isn't it? And she seizes the opportunity to speak to Lenny. She seizes the opportunity to be listened to. This is the only time anyone probably has ever listened to her at length like this. So she talks about her past, she talks about her relationship with her mother, she talks about her frustrations, she talks about her dreams, she talks about her dissatisfaction with Curly and how she's kind of trapped in this very unhappy marriage. It's like a free counselling session for her, isn't it? And notice that Steinbeck has done the same thing here as he's done in chapter 4. In both cases, he uses Lenny as a tool to allow these two characters, Crooks and Curly's wife, to open up. Imagine what it would be like if those conversations hadn't taken place. Yeah, how little you would know about Crooks and Curly's wife. You wouldn't have heard from them at all, do you? These are people who, for once in their lives, get the opportunity to open up and reveal their deepest thoughts and emotions and frustrations and despair, I suppose. She talks about her dreams, doesn't she, at length here, about wanting to be a movie star and so on, doesn't she? How do you respond to that? My initial response when I first read the novel, I think, was to feel less sympathy for her in terms of her dreams not having come true than the other characters, in that I think I'd always thought about her dreams as being very self-centered. If you think about the other characters, George and Letty, what do they dream of? They dream of some independence, some autonomy, don't they? They dream of being able to own their own ranch, a sense of belonging, companionship. What does Candy dream of? He dreams again of companionship and belonging, but also financial security in his old age. What about Crooks? What does he dream of? He kind of dreams of, I think, probably inclusion more than anything else. He cannot believe it when the possibility seems to present itself that he could be with these other people and be included with them. Yeah. All those things like independence and inclusion and financial security in your old age and companionship, all those things to me, they seem like basic human rights. Do you know what I mean? You couldn't deprive anyone of the right to want those things, could you? Whereas dreaming of being a movie star, is that a basic human right? Maybe not. Okay, and it just seems so much more trivial in comparison, doesn't it? So self-centered. Everyone else is dreaming of basic things. She's dreaming of the glamour and the stardom, isn't it? Is she just attention-seeking? Okay, but I think when you reflect on it, you can look at it, and I think maybe what Steinbeck is saying is that, well, what has she got to dream of? What opportunities does she have? What else could she dream of in 1930s America? Look at the other women in the novel. The only other women really are the prostitutes, aren't they, that are described? So she could dream of being a prostitute, exploited by men. She's already married, isn't she? That was another dream, I suppose, she initially had. That was a potential escape, something she could hope for the future. But here she is now married, controlled very much by a man, and trapped in a dysfunctional marriage. So what's the other option? Well, maybe she could dream of being a film star. But even that, if you think about it, beneath the apparent glamour and the success, basically her image and her life will be determined by men. Men who entice her into a job and control her in that job in terms of what she says, what she does, what she looks like. The movie industry, Hollywood is a certainly in the 1930s, and maybe to a large extent even now, is controlled by men. So every option, every route that she could possibly consider for herself as a woman is one that involves exploitation, abuse, or control by men. There's no escape except death. And then actually, when you look at her death in chapter 5, there is, I think, that sense of escape. There's a sense of release and relief almost, because nothing else would be able to take the pain of her life away from her. Look at how Steinbeck describes it. He says, and the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention were all gone from her face. Look at the and here. It's this sense of a release from the ache, from this desire for significance. At least, finally, the strains of her life, the pressures of society, the kind of like the sense of constantly being thwarted in whatever she tries to achieve. Yeah, that's gone. And she's just left this innocent little child. Because that's what Steinbeck then focuses on, isn't it? He describes her as sweet and young and innocent and childlike, like a sleeping little child on the hay. That's how he focuses on her at that point, isn't it? And look how he uses sounds here as well to create this mood of grief and sorrow. He kind of forces us into feeling sympathy and into this sense of grieving and mourning for her death at this moment. Look at this bit. Look at the sounds. He says, as happens sometimes, a moment settled and hovered and remained for much more than a moment, and sound stopped and movement stopped for much, much more than a moment. To me, the sounds there are so effective. Listen to the sounds. They're so soft, aren't they? As happens sometimes, a moment settled and hovered and remained for much more than a moment, and sound stopped and movement stopped for much, much more than a moment. Can you hear? It's like as if there's like this soft music going on in the background, isn't there? It's kind of forcing us to stop and to consider and to mourn the loss of this innocent little girl that's lying there on the hay. Yeah, Steinbeck forces us, I think, at that moment into considering her as a victim. Yeah, and actually, isn't the novel all about victims? Curley's wife has a broken neck. Crooks has a crooked back. Candy has a lost hand. Lenny and Curley's wife both lose their life. This is a novel about your dreams being crushed and broken and lost.